Montana Territory, late June 1883, the water had not stopped rising for 2 days. Celia Orwood stood barefoot in the mud, skirt soaked up to her waist, holding one child on her hip while the other clung to her sleeve. The river had come fast, swallowing their sod house and the half-acre of potato Rose her husband left behind when he died last winter. There was no dry land left for them, not in the valley, not in her memory either. "Mommy, is Papa coming?" Hazel's voice cracked with cold and fear. "No, baby," Celia said gently, brushing wet hair from her daughter's cheek. "Just hold on." She had nowhere to go. The neighbors were gone, either driven out by the water or moved back east when the winter broke their hearts. Everything she had was in a burlap sack tied to her back and in her arms Hazel, 5, and Hope, 2. She walked north for hours, through the shallows, past drowned fence lines and broken barns. When the sun dropped low, turning the flooded prairie gold and pink, she reached a rise above the waterline. A man on horseback was there, watching the horizon. His hat shadowed his face, but he saw her. He swung down fast, boots hitting the dirt with a thud. "Ma'am," Celia blinked up at him, too tired to speak. He stepped forward, careful not to spook the children. "The river take your place," she nodded. "You got folks nearby," she shook her head. He looked at the girls. "You need to sit." "I need somewhere dry," she said. He nodded once, deep and sure. "This land's big enough for you two. I got a place up the ridge." He glanced at the girls again. "They can rest. You all can eat." Celia studied him. He was younger than she expected, maybe late 20s, 30 at most, tall, broad, sun-browned skin. His voice was warm, a little scratchy, like someone who did not talk much unless it mattered. She adjusted Hazel on her hip. "You live alone?" "I do." She hesitated. He saw it. "You can ride. I'll walk beside." Celia nodded slowly. "What's your name?" "Zeke Nash." She met his eyes. "Celia Orwood." Zeke reached up and gently took Hope from her arms. "Let me help." Celia stiffened, then watched as he cradled the toddler against his chest like she was something breakable. Hope blinked up at him and laid her head on his shoulder without a sound. That was the first moment Celia let herself breathe. The cabin sat a mile up a dry slope, tucked between cottonwoods. It was small but clean, with a porch and a wooden swing that creaked in the breeze. A corral sat behind it, half full with horses, and smoke drifted from the chimney as Zeke stirred the fire inside and ladled stew into bowls. "You built this?" Celia asked, folding the girls into a quilt by the hearth. "Every board." She nodded slowly, watching the way he moved, quiet, capable, no wasted steps. He did not ask questions, just handed her a bowl and crouched beside the fire. Hazel watched him with wide eyes. "Are you a cowboy?" Zeke smiled. "Something like it." "I ride fence, drive cattle, mend things." Hazel leaned against her mother. "You smell like horses," he chuckled. "That's accurate." Celia sipped the stew. It was hot, rich with beans and salted pork. She ate slowly, savoring every bite while Hope fell asleep against her. Zeke sat across from her, taking his time. "You can stay as long as you need." She looked up. "I can work, I sew, and I can cook. I am not here to ask for charity." "I know that," he said. They sat in silence for a while, just the crackle of fire and the creak of wood. Later, when the girls were asleep on a pile of quilts in the corner, Celia stepped outside. The moonlight made the land shine silver. She wrapped her arms around herself. Zeke came out a moment later, carrying a mug of coffee. "Figured you might want this." She took it with quiet thanks. "You always take in strangers." "No, you are the first." She sipped the coffee. "Why now?" "Because you needed it." Celia looked up at him. "And because this land is big enough for me too," Zeke nodded. "It is." They stood there, side by side, not touching. The night was quiet, but something warm settled between them, like the first breath after holding it too long. Inside, Hazel stirred and called for her mother. Celia turned to go, but paused at the door. "Thank you, Zeke." He nodded once, eyes steady. "You are welcome, Celia." She went inside, heart beating in a way it had not in a long time, and Zeke stayed on the porch a little longer, watching the stars, already thinking of what kind of future might begin with a woman and 2 little girls showing up in the mud. The hens fussed low in the coop as morning peeled back the dark. Celia stood at the edge of the porch, braiding Hazel's hair by feel more than sight. Her fingers worked steady, but her eyes tracked the slope behind the barn, where Zeke had gone before first light, carrying a shovel and a coil of rope. Hazel leaned back against her knees. Is he gonna catch something? Celia tied the braid off with a strip of muslin. He said the fence line was down near the ravine, might be a calf loose. Will he bring it back, if he can? Hazel twisted to look up at her. He's strong. Celia brushed a hand down her daughter's back. He is. Inside, Hope stirred on the cot, thumb in her mouth, curls tangled from sleep. Celia moved to lift her, but paused when she saw the child's eyes drift shut again. She let her rest. There was no rush here, not anymore. By the time Zeke returned, sweat clung dark along his collar and one sleeve was torn. He led a young steer behind him, roped at the neck and limping slightly. Celia stepped off the porch without thinking, catching the gate open for him. Snagged his leg on a downed post, Zeke said, nodding toward the calf. Not deep, I'll clean it. She watched him work. He moved slow and kind, not just careful but considerate, like the animal's pain mattered to him. When it tried to pull away, he steadied it with one hand and went on without raising his voice. You've done that before, she said, more times than I can count. He looked up. You want to keep watch while I stitch it? Celia nodded, stepping closer, one hand on the rope just behind the calf's head. She held firm when it shifted, and Zeke met her gaze with something quiet and approving. Later, when the calf had been loosed back into the corral and Zeke had washed the blood from his hands, they sat on two crates beneath the cottonwood behind the barn. The girls played nearby, turning stones into pretend biscuits and talking softly to each other. Zeke rolled his sleeves to the elbow. You ever think of leaving Montana? She folded her hands in her lap. I did last winter, after he passed. There was talk of St. Paul where his cousin lives, but I couldn't make myself go. Why not? She traced a line in the dirt with her boot. Because I buried him here, because I knew what the land needed from me, and because I couldn't stomach the thought of being someone's burden. Zeke watched her for a long moment. You aren't that now. She didn't look up. You don't know me, I'm learning. She finally met his eyes. What do you think you've learned? That you carry hard things without complaint, that you don't ask for more than you need, that you're better with rope than most men I've worked beside. A breath caught in her throat. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen without pity. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. I lost a brother to the mines outside Helena. Ma died the spring after. I came here to get quiet, not to be alone. There's a difference. Celia didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the cottonwood leaves like water running. You built all this, she said finally, her voice low. And you still let strangers walk through your door. Zeke stood and dusted his hands. Not strangers anymore. That night, the girls curled against each other on the small bed while Celia folded worn clothes into neat piles by the hearth. Zeke came in from the barn last, hair damp from washing, the scent of saddle soap still clinging to him. He paused in the doorway, unsure. You can sit, she said without turning. I'm not going to run. He stepped inside and took the chair near the fire. She glanced at him. I'll need a needle and coarse thread. The hem on Hazel's dress is coming loose. There's a box in the drawer near the stove, my mother's things. She sew? Zeke nodded. Better than anyone I knew. They didn't speak after that. Celia finished folding. Zeke watched the flames. The quiet between them wasn't heavy. It settled like a blanket, warm and familiar. When she rose to check on the girls, she paused beside his chair. I'll make biscuits in the morning, she said, if you've got flour. I do, she nodded once and turned toward the back room. Zeke's voice followed her softly. I'll be here when you wake. Celia didn't answer, but her hand lingered on the doorframe before she stepped through. And in the stillness that followed, something unspoken settled between them, something rooted, not rushed, and already beginning to grow. The August heat settled deep in the bones of the land, and the air hung thick with the scent of pine sap and sun-warmed dust. Celia stood at the edge of the vegetable patch that Zeke had once let go to weeds. Now, under her hand, rows of beans and squash pushed up from the soil, green and certain. She wiped the back of her wrist across her brow and squinted toward the barn, where Zeke was sharpening a drawknife on a sandstone block. You plan on carving all morning? She asked, easing a basket of beans to her hip. Zeke paused, tested the blade against his thumb, and rose. Only until you tell me what else needs doing. She walked toward him, fingers brushing the bean leaves from her skirt. I was thinking of hauling down a few of those old fence rails from the loft. There's enough good wood left to mend the water trough. He glanced toward the corral. You reckon that'll hold? It'll hold longer than that cracked tin you patched it with. He gave a low chuckle, then wiped his hands on his trousers. I'll cut the rails, you guide the nails. Celia followed him into the barn, where shadows stretched long beneath the rafters. The air inside was cooler, still holding the scent of last winter's hay. Zeke climbed the ladder first, boots steady on each rung, while she waited below with her arms crossed. You always this quiet when you work with someone? She asked. He passed a rail down to her, careful of splinters. Only when I enjoy it. She blinked, caught off guard. That's not what I expected you to say. Zeke handed down another. What you expect, something about efficiency or silence being useful. He met her eyes from the loft. I figure you've had enough silence for one lifetime. They worked in rhythm, sweat slicking their brows, the hammers ring sharp in the stillness. When the trough was mended and the tools hung back in the shed, they sat beneath the slope of the hill, where the wild grasses bent in the breeze. The girls were collecting snail shells by the stream, their laughter faint but steady. Zeke pulled off his hat and set it beside him. You ever think of teaching? Teaching, Celia looked over. You've got a way of explaining things that makes a person want to listen. Hazel's already reading better since you started working with her. She turned a blade of grass between her fingers. I taught a year in Indiana before I married. Just a class of farm children in a clapboard room with a broken stove. Why'd you stop? I thought I'd be needed more at home. She ran her thumb along the grass blade. Turns out I was wrong, but it's not something I talk about. Zeke didn't push. He leaned back on his elbows and let the sun warm his face. You ever want to try it again? I'd help you build a schoolhouse. We've got more than enough lumber and the valley's settlin' again. Families'll come back. Celia stared at him. You do that? I would. She looked toward the distant hills where the sky turned pale with heat. I don't know how to want things for myself anymore. Then let's start small, he said. You want stew or cornbread tonight? I want both, she said. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to smile without apology. That evening, the scent of baking filled the cabin, and the light through the windows turned amber. Celia moved easily between the hearth and the table while the girls set out tin plates, and Zeke split kindling near the firebox. When the meal was ready, they bowed their heads while Hazel whispered grace. Afterward, Hope crawled into Zeke's lap without invitation, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb. He looked to Celia with a question in his eyes, but she just nodded once. She's taken to you, she said quietly. I'd never step in where I wasn't wanted, he said. Celia poured a second cup of coffee and passed it to him. You haven't. Outside, the crickets began their song, and the last of the light faded from the ridgeline. Zeke stayed at the table while she cleaned, and when the girls were asleep, he rose and walked her to the porch. They stood in the doorway, the night thick around them. You said you came here to get quiet, she said, her voice nearly lost to the dark. What happens when the quiet starts to feel like something else? Zeke turned toward her. Then I stop waiting and I start building again. Only this time, not just for myself. She didn't speak, not right away. But she reached for his hand, and when their fingers met, she didn't let go. The mid-September wind came down from the north, dry and restless. Celia stood behind the cabin, a length of linen pinned to the wash line, her sleeves rolled past her elbows. The air held the sharp edge of coming frost. She could feel it in her hands, the way her knuckles ached by mid-morning. Zeke was building something near the edge of the slope, a lean-to. By the look of it, each beam fitted with quiet precision. He'd said nothing about it, just started hauling timber 2 days ago after returning from the far pasture. Hazel sat nearby with a small slate in her lap, sounding out words from a tattered primer someone had left behind at the old line shack. Hope played with a stick and a bucket, chasing wind-blown leaves between the tree roots. Celia turned from the line and walked toward the half-built structure. You planning to tell me what this is? She asked, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Zeke looked up, a nail held between his teeth. He set it aside and leaned against the frame. Storage, mostly, maybe a place to work through the colder months. She studied the size of it. It's wide enough for benches, he nodded, and tall enough for windows. Celia folded her arms. You're building me a schoolhouse. Thought you might want to choose the paint yourself, he said. she looked away toward the ridge, swallowing against the sudden tightness in her throat. I haven't asked for this. You didn't need to. Celia walked the perimeter of the unfinished walls, trailing her fingers along the grain. The valley's still thin on children. Won't stay that way. There's a family due from Kansas come November. Another from Missouri asked about grazing rights last week. She turned back to him. You don't mind if this land becomes more than yours. It's already more than mine. The wind picked up, rattling the leaves above. Celia let the silence settle, then glanced past his shoulder to where the horses moved slow in the field. I'd like to teach again, she said. Zeke reached for the hammer. Then we'll have it ready before first snow. That night, after the girls were asleep and the fire had burned low, Celia stood at the window, watching the moon rise pale over the cottonwoods. Her arms were wrapped around herself, shawl loose at her shoulders. The cabin didn't creak the way the sod house had, and she found she missed the sound less than expected. Zeke came in from latching the barn and set his gloves on the table. He didn't speak right away. She didn't turn. I wrote to my brother, he said after a moment. She looked over her shoulder. I thought he passed. Other one, younger, he's in Miles City, runs a wagon shop. She stepped away from the window. What made you write now? I wanted him to know I'm not alone anymore. Celia crossed the room, quiet as wind over grass. You sure that's true? Zeke met her eyes. I'm sure. She watched him a moment longer, then without hesitation she reached for his hand. He took it, palm broad and warm, and she felt the calluses pressed against her knuckles. I'm tired of waiting for permission to feel safe, she said. You don't have to wait. He didn't kiss her. He didn't move closer. He just held her hand, steady and certain, until all the old weight in her chest began to ease. They stood like that as the embers dimmed, the night stretching long and still around them, and for the first time since the floodwaters rose, the world felt like something she could meet without flinching. By the last week of October, the first frost had silvered the grass, and wood smoke from nearby homesteads marked the edges of the valley. The lean-to had grown into a full room with paneled walls and a single-paned window that faced east. Celia lined the shelves with cloth-bound readers, arithmetic slates, and a jar of chalk stubs sent from Miles City in a parcel wrapped with Zeke's brother's careful hand. The schoolroom wasn't finished, not fully, but it breathed like something alive. It smelled of pine dust and ink, and when Hazel sat at the wide table and traced letters with her fingertip, Celia saw her former life and present one folding into each other without fracture. Zeke stood in the doorway that evening, shoulder against the frame, watching her adjust the oil lamp on the desk. You think you'll miss it? He asked. She turned. Miss what? Teaching for strangers, for pay, for some board's approval. Celia straightened the lamp's wick. What I missed was having something of my own to give. Doesn't matter who receives it, just that it's needed. He stepped inside and ran his fingers along the table's edge. You've changed this place. So have you, she said. Zeke looked down at a slate Hazel had left behind, her name scratched in crooked letters. My brother sent word. Their youngest girl's ready for lessons. He's thinking of coming this way, settling near the creek bed. Celia's breath caught. You think he'll like it here? I think if he sees what I have, he'll understand why I stayed. She moved to stand beside him. What do you have, Zeke? He didn't answer right away. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. I went into town last week. Talked to the pastor. Celia took the paper. Her fingers trembled only slightly. Inside was a marriage license, unsigned. She looked up. You were that certain? Zeke's voice was low. I told myself if you smiled when you saw the schoolroom finished, I'd ask. You smiled, Celia. She held the paper a moment longer, then set it down on the table between them. I buried a man I loved, she said. I raised 2 daughters with nothing but will and borrowed ground. I won't tie myself to someone unless I know they'll hold through every season. Zeke stepped forward, hands open. I watched you take a flooded life and make it fertile. I watched you carry grief without hiding it. You don't need to tie yourself to me, Celia. But I'll stand beside you every morning you let me. She looked at his hands, then into his eyes. There's no one else I trust to do that. He let out a breath. Then say yes. She nodded once. Yes. They married in the clearing behind the cabin, under the cottonwoods whose leaves had turned to gold. Hazel wore a ribbon in her hair, and Hope held a bouquet of prairie asters. Zeke's brother arrived 2 days before, bringing his wife and daughters. They slept in the hayloft until the back room could hold them. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep tangled together in a quilt, Celia and Zeke sat on the porch, the license signed and tucked into her sewing box. "You ever think about leaving now?" he asked, voice low. She leaned into his side, their shoulders pressed close. "Not once. Even with the hard winters, even then," Zeke wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We'll make it through, everyone." They sat in silence, the stars wheeling overhead, the valley quiet as breath. Years passed. The schoolroom grew into a gathering place. By the third spring, 5 children came each morning, their boots muddy and their slates tucked under their arms. Celia taught them to read, to reckon sums, to mind their words and their hands. She taught them that growing things, whether in the field or in themselves, took time. Zeke built a second barn and a third stall. He trained Hazel to ride, taught Hope to mend tack and pick hooves. He never once raised his voice, but the girls listened just the same. On their 7th anniversary, Zeke carved a cradle from ash wood. It sat beside the hearth, where the newest daughter, Ruth, slept with her tiny fists curled against her chest. Celia watched them one evening, Zeke with Ruth in his arms, Hazel reading aloud beside him, Hope drawing shapes in the ash at the hearth. The cabin was full of light and the steady hum of breath and warmth and belonging. She stepped outside. The wind had turned soft again, like it did each spring. The land was greening, the first buds visible on the cottonwoods. Zeke joined her a moment later, wrapping his coat around her shoulders before she could ask. "You still glad you stayed?" she asked. He looked out across the fields, where the fence posts stood straight and the soil had already been turned for beans. "I never wanted anything else." She leaned into him. "Neither did I." And under that boundless Montana sky, with the fields behind them and the firelight flickering through the window, they stood as man and wife, as partners, as something stronger than either had been alone. The years ahead would hold storms and sickness and long winters, but they'd face each one together, hand in hand, without fear. Because love had come and it had stayed.